What's up YouTube, and welcome back to the finale of the SBX Nitro Buggy build. This video will be for back 73 through 20, and I meant to get this video out sooner, but with the work being so hectic and the fast approaching holidays, it just made it hard to get everything done. So as you can see, I've already started breaking out the contents of back 17, which includes installation of the servos, assembly of the linkages, and installation of the radio tray of the chassis. So let's get on with it. So going to speed up sorting everything out, as the radio tray is pretty self-explanatory and nothing seems to really jump out at me as anything to call out. So the first thing I'm going to do is just get started on getting the steering linkages set up. Go ahead and start by trimming the link ends off of the tree mold and locate the steering link. Take note that there is a shorter end of the link that goes towards the front of the car, and that there is a right and a left hand thread as well, so be mindful of that. Threading the end links on wasn't too bad, and you will see that I'm measuring the distance between them to get to the 22mm specified in the manual. So when it comes to inserting the ball ends to the steering links, note that the orientation of the ball end matters. The flat mounting surface on the front of the steering link faces down, and the flat surface that will mate to the servo arm will face upward. The servos that I will be using for this build will be the USRC 1776 high-speed, high-torque 25-tooth servos. I've heard nothing but great things about them, and they look great and they feel solid and robust, so let me get them prepped and get them ready to be mounted. So you will have to trim the servo spacers or the risers that will help elevate the servos up from the tray a bit so that they do not rest on the chassis directly. You might not have to use them if you're using servos that use lower profiles, so you're going to have to determine that for yourselves as the time comes. I'm going to use the rubber mounting tabs and the brass screw guides that are provided with the servos for now. I know that there are better and nicer looking options, but I'm going to use what was included to keep it simple. I'm also just going to pre-mount the servos with the provided spacers, and I'm going to feed the wire just directly under the tray. I will worry about routing the wires neatly once both of the servos are mounted. I'm applying some thread locker to an aluminum servo horn I had laying in my box, rather than use the included composite piece. The arm on the servo horn that I'm using is threaded, so I'm going to apply some thread locker to the screw to make sure it won't back out. WIRC also offers aluminum option parts for both 23 and 25 tooth servos. I'm using the same servo for the throttle, and the process is pretty much the same as mounting the steering servo. I will say that mounting the servos to the tray can be a little difficult, especially if you have fat fingers like me. This is because you have to line up the mounting holes in the servo mount blocks under the tray, and it's a tight fit. The easiest way for me in the end was using some needle nose pliers to hold the block in place while starting to thread the screws into the block. I'm going to just go ahead and mount the battery cover since I don't have the battery just yet, and I want to include this step in the video. I like that the embossed WIRC logo is molded directly on the battery cover, and the fact that there's a predetermined location for the transponder to be mounted as well. I also like that the cable routing passages are also molded into the design of the radio tray itself to make it for a nice and tidy installation. Next up, I'm deciding where I want to install the power switch that I'm going to use. It's not a switch in the normal sense, in that it's pretty much a jumper that completes a circuit and requires a decent amount of force to remove. I've never used one of these before, and it has some laying around, so I thought I'd give them a try. I decided the best place is farthest back on the receiver cover to leave plenty of space for the receiver and all of the connections that are going to be underneath the cover. I also do not mount the switch from underneath the cover because it would take a bit too much space in the compartment I want to use for wire management. I scored the mounting holes onto the receiver cover and used my hand drill to get some pilot holes drilled. Then I just followed it up with the body reamer to get them to the size that I needed. I'll use a couple of short 2.0 cap screws and lock nuts to secure it to the radio tray. There is excessive wire, and I have been working on learning how to trim and terminate RC connection wires, but that's another task and video entirely. For now, I'm just going to leave them as is, and I will get it tucked and organized the best that I can. Installing the receiver cover is pretty straightforward, just 4 cap-headed 1.5 screws and you're golden. I've already mounted the secondary cover, which I can only assume is for the traditional switch, as it's not clear in the manual. Last step is to insert the jumper wire to make sure that I don't lose it. As I can already see, this is going to have to be something I'm going to have to get used to. I'll snug everything up, give the whole assembly a once over, and it looks good to go. So on to the next step, which is mounting the radio tray onto the car. Mounting the radio tray to the car requires 7 M3x10mm flathead screws that I start with an electric driver and then finished off hand tighten. That is pretty much it for back 17, and man, it's going to be almost a shame to get this work of art dirty, but the dirt is where this thing is built to be. I love the red accents mixed in with the carbon fiber components. I might just have to build another one as a shelf queen, I'm telling you that much right now. Alright, so on to bag number 18, and it's time to build the front shocks. For the most part, I like to build RC cars, except for the shocks. For some reason, and I don't know why, I just don't like building them. Anyway, let me get them unpacked, and time to sort out the components. After inserting the O-rings into the lock spring adjustment collars, I thread them onto the shock bodies. I will say that so far, getting these collars threaded wasn't as big of a pain in the butt as it is on some of the other builds that I've done. I'm just going to go ahead and thread them up toward the top, and I'll worry about final adjustment once the car is complete and ready for final setup. Next, I'll start inserting the X-ring, O-rings, and washers into the lower shock body. First off, I'm going to use some of the shock oil to lube the components before I insert them. The order the components go from top down is O-ring, washer, O-ring, and then X-ring, finished off by the lower shock body cap. Now I'm going to start prepping the shock shaft and piston for assembly into the shock body. The shock shaft is threaded on both ends, but the end with the shelf machined into it is where the piston will be mounted. The pistons for this kit are 8 hole by 1.2, just as an FYI. Anyway, locate the shock piston washer and then the piston, and take note that the piston has a relief molded into it and that is meant to mate to the washer. Next, locate the lock nut and thread it onto the shock shaft, and then grab your shock pliers and tighten it in the lock nut until it stops at maybe a quarter turn more. Next up, it's time to insert the shock shaft into the shock body and thread the lower shock mount onto the shock shaft. I apply some shock oil to the shock shaft before inserting it into the shock body to make sure that I do not damage the O-rings as they pass through the lower shock body. Before I thread the lower shock mount, I always take a body reamer and lightly ream the shock mount to help get the thread started, but not too much to compromise the strength of the part. The manual specifies to thread them until the distance from the lower shock body to the shock mount is 32 millimeters. And just repeat the same process for the second front shock. And for the sake of shortening this video, I'm not going to review the process of assembling the rear shocks because the process is the same, except for the length of the shock bodies and the shock shafts, obviously. The rear shock should measure 40 millimeters from the lower shock body to the lower shock mount. The next step is to assemble the shock caps. From the factory, the kit comes with medium bladders, but WIRC does offer soft and hard bladder options as well. I wish they included components for both bladder and emulsion setups in the kit. I'm also bummed that the shock caps are vented, but not by using bleeder screw shock caps. The shock caps with the bleeder screws are option parts, however, and I'm definitely going to order a set, because there is a time and a place for either shock package, but I usually always run the bleeder caps on either setup. The fit between the shock bladder and the shock cap is a tight one, so I'm just going to use a 1.5mm round end hex driver, as they don't have blunt edges and less likely to damage the bladder if I press too hard. And once it's inserted, I will test fit it by threading the shock cap onto the shock body to get it fully seated. Then locate the ball end of the lower shock mount and insert it using your shock plier tool. Remember to insert it from the side of the part that has a glossier finish, like I mentioned in previous videos. Now I'm going to move on to filling the shocks with the 600 CST shock fluid that's included with the kit. Although 600 for both front and rear shocks with an 8-hole piston would not usually be a baseline setup that I would start at, I'm going to hold true to what the kit is specifying and go with that until the car can go out for some braking laps. I have my J&T bearing carbon shock stand set up already, and I'm going to start filling the shock a little bit short of the top of the shock and then slowly compress the shock, but not let it come up out from underneath the fluid level. I will work a few compression cycles and purge any air bubbles from under the piston, and then set the shock on the stand and let it sit until the bubbles work themselves up out of the top. While this is happening, I'm going to repeat the same step on the second shock. Once the air bubbles have worked themselves out of the shock, I will grab a rag and get ready to screw the shock cap onto the shock to set the rebound. Seeing as the included bladder is supposedly the medium grade, it feels pretty firm, and the shock caps do not have bleeder screws. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get the shock to be as dead as I would normally build it. So I'm going to do my best, and as I said before, I'll decide what to do once the car hits the track after a few tanks. While I normally don't build my shocks with bladders, I'm going to go ahead and screw the cap onto the shock body until it starts to bottom out, plus maybe a quarter turn. Then I'm going to back out that quarter turn and slowly compress the shock to let the air escape until it gets close to the end of the shock stroke, towards the top. While holding the shock at that position, I screw the cap as tight as I can get it by hand, and I keep holding in that compressed position and wipe away any excess shock oil that came out of the cap vent holes. I will cycle the shocks a few times and then check to see how much rebound there is. If it's way too much, then I'll just unthread the shock cap and start the process over again. And that's including letting the air bubbles work their way out of the top of the shock before trying to set the rebound again. In this case, I'm okay with the amount of rebound the shocks have, as the shock oil is not what I would normally use out of the box. I will really torque down the shock cap using the shock pliers to hold the body in place, and then just repeat the step on the second shock. To get the shock boot over the lower shock mount, apply a small amount of shock oil onto the shock end and then start working the shock boot over. Clean your hands with a clean rag or shop towel so you can feed the shock shaft along the boot until it's all the way through and you can secure the shock boot to the shock body. This method is by far one of the easiest ways to get this done without damaging the shock boot. Slide the shock spring on and then compress and hold the spring to leave enough room to insert the lower spring cup. Take caution to not let the lower shock boot come off of the shock mount to ensure the seal stays intact. To keep the dirt and debris away from the shock shaft and not letting it work itself into the shock body and contaminate the fluid. Now I finally get to mount the front shocks of the car. I'll start by inserting the M3x28 button heads through the back of the shock tower. The manual is illustrating that the base setup is using the third hole from the top down. I'll thread it all the way in by hand and then I'll tighten it down with my hex driver and an open end wrench. I'll snug it plus a quarter turn. Be careful not to go too tight here because you risk snapping the screw from over torquing it. Insert the two shock bushings into the eyelets of the shock caps. I'm doing this step out of sequence because I did not want to lose these bushings as there was a gap in when I filmed this part. Slide the shocks onto the standoff and then secure it with the nylon lock nut, hand tight for now. Then I'll locate one silver and one black button head. The silver is to go on the driver right and is the left hand thread. I'll thread these in by hand and get them started with my 2.5 hex driver until they bottom out plus a quarter turn. Bag 19 for the rear shocks is pretty much the same process as bag number 18 as far as how the shocks are prepped, assembled, filled, and rebounds being set. So I figured I would just show you a few clips of the bag contents and review some of the key mounting instructions. So for the rear shocks, the distance from the lower shock cap to the top of the lower shock mount should be 40 millimeters. When mounting the rear shocks, the manual illustrates the top of the rear shock mounting position should be the third hole down from the top. For mounting the rear lower shock mount, the manual illustrates the base setup should be the outermost mounting hole. For the lower rear shock mounting, the manual is illustrating that the silver left-hand threaded screw should be on the driver left. So finally the shocks have been mounted and the buggy's looking so good, and I can see the end of the build is near. Part and build quality has been great, and aside from a few steps on the manual that I thought could have been more detailed, such as filling and bleeding the shocks, it has gone smooth, and the fit and finish is what I would expect from a kit on the higher end of the cost spectrum. So bag number 20 is going to cover mounting of the rear wing and assembly of the throttle and brake linkages. So far, looking at the wing, it's definitely a different material that I'm used to and is a bit more flexible as well, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So the wing does not come pre-drilled from the factory, and there's a reason for that. The wing is marked with different mounting options based on your preference for how far back or forward you would like to mount the wing. From what I remember, the farther back the wing is, the more stable the car is, and the farther forward it is has an effect on steering potentially, but do not quote me, as I am not an expert on aero by any means. Here I'm just trying to demonstrate how much of a difference there is on how the wing looks on the mount forward and back. I opted to mount the wing farther back on the mount because I need as much stability as I can get, and I'll just use my body reamer to get the hole started. This kit utilizes a different method for securing the wing to the mount. It uses a lightweight aluminum pin that is threaded on both sides, and it slides through a bore in the wing mount. When inserted flush on both sides, it lines up the threaded mounting holes with the holes in the wing and the wing button for a strong mounting surface. It's a tight fit, so you might have to persuade it a bit. Next, grab the corresponding wing spacer that matches the mounting position number you selected on your wing, and take note of the directional arrow on that spacer is facing forward for the position you selected. So in my case, I selected position 4, which has a spacer all to itself. Once the wing is mounted, grab the included wing buttons and thread the M4x18 flathead screws and hand tighten them plus a quarter turn. WIRC does offer high downforce wing options if you'd like in multiple colors to get that look that you really want. So check them out for parts, accessories, and swag at www.wircracing.com. So now it's time for me to get the throttle and brake linkages assembled and mounted. So first things first, I'm going to get it all organized and laid out. I'm going to trim off the throttle servo horn that I'm going to need for my application, which is a 25 tooth. First thing I do is locate the levers that the throttle and brake linkages will be threaded through. Take note to the orientation the brake levers are in when threading them through so that the front and rear levers are facing the same way and will not cause any binding. Then I will grab my drill and insert one of the brake linkages and secure it tight with the threaded portion of the link facing out. And then very carefully I hold the lever in one hand and start the drill clockwise to thread the rod through the lever until you feel it protrude on the other side. Then I'll stop the drill, reverse it, and back it out. I'll do this a few more times, maybe 3 or 4, and I do this to make adjusting the brakes easier, more precise, and much easier on the fingers. Also take a note that the lever may get hot, so be careful. I'll repeat this process on both the front and rear brake links. Assembly of the throttle and brake linkage is pretty straightforward if you follow the manual illustrations. Again, this is the part that I wish the engineers had provided a bit more insight as to how much of the link should protrude out past the brake levers. You are, however, limited to how much thread is available on the brake linkage, so you're obviously not going to go and adjust past that point. I also do not apply any thread locker to any of the grub screws used for the adjustment collars, as I've never had one back out. And these are 1.5, so they're easy to strip, so take caution of that too. So as I just said, I'm going to use my best judgment for setting the brake links to get smooth operation and consistent engagement of the brakes. I guess you could say it's a tribal knowledge type of adjustment, and everyone seems to set their brake points how they are used to and what works for them and the car. I would advise you to do the same, and you can always try testing how the brakes feel independently front to rear with the car down on the bench. Hold one end of the car up, wheels off the ground, roll the car, and engage the brakes with the transmitter. Then you can feel how strong or how suddenly they engage and adjust to your liking from there. You won't truly know until you fire up the car and put it down on the ground and do some test pulls up and down to see how they feel. Once you get them set, you will be able to get them there where you want most of the time while on the bench from there. This goes back to why I use a drill to help soften the plastic, so to speak, to help make adjustment of the brakes that much easier. For the throttle linkage, I assemble it per the manual and mount it to the servo horn to allow me to mock it up on the car. I say mock up because in some cases, based on the engine you use and how they ship it, you may have to loosen the adjustment screw on the engine to allow the carburetor to be clocked to be in line with the throttle linkage, and or clock the carburetor slide to line up as well. You will want to make sure you get the throttle linkage to be as straight of a plane as you can to ensure smooth, even motion of the servo and throttle linkage. So as I wrap up this build, I want to thank those of you that followed along and hope that you like, comment, and share. A mishap on my camera lost some of the clips and final thoughts on the build, but we will be back with more on this channel, we can promise you that. More videos are coming with our initial thoughts and lessons learned on this platform so far, along with some current events and some big news for this WIRC West Coast team. We hope you all have a happy holiday and an amazing new year, because we most definitely are. Take care and see you all soon.